Born Malcolm Little in 1925, his story begins not with speeches or crowds, but with fear, loss, and a world already set against him. From his earliest days, Malcolm was surrounded by forces determined to silence black voices and crush black ambition. His family lived under constant threat, moving from place to place in search of safety that never truly came. Violence, intimidation, and injustice were not abstract ideas to him, they were part of everyday life, shaping his understanding of the world before he was old enough to fully name it. When his father died under suspicious circumstances, the message was clear. Standing up for dignity came at a high cost. Soon after, his mother, overwhelmed by pressure and grief, was removed from her children, and Malcolm was separated from the people who anchored his identity. What remained was a young boy forced to navigate a society that offered him no protection, no fairness, and very few second chances. These early experiences did more than break his childhood, they forged a fierce awareness that the system itself was deeply flawed. This is where the story truly begins, not with anger alone, but with questions. Why was injustice so normalized? Why were certain lives treated as disposable? And what did it truly mean to be free in a world built on inequality? Malcolm Little would carry these questions with him through every chapter of his life, from the streets to prison, from silence to a voice that would one day shake nations. In this video, we will explore how those early wounds became the foundation of one of the most powerful transformations in modern history. We will uncover how pain became purpose, and how a broken childhood helped create a man who refused to accept lies as truth. If stories that challenge history, power, and perspective matter to you, make sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications, because this is only the beginning. The questions planted in Malcolm's childhood did not disappear as he grew older. Instead, they followed him into classrooms, where he quickly learned that intelligence alone was not enough to overcome the limits imposed on him. Despite his strong academic performance, he was told quietly, but firmly, that certain ambitions were not meant for someone like him. That moment did not merely discourage him, it clarified something far more painful. The world he lived in had already decided how far he was allowed to go. Disillusioned and stripped of faith in fairness, Malcolm walked away from school carrying a growing sense of rejection and anger that would soon shape his next choices. As a young man, he drifted through cities like Boston and Harlem, chasing survival, status, and escape in a society that offered him few legitimate paths to dignity. The streets promised a fast sense of control and recognition, even if it came at a high price. For a time, Malcolm believed he had outsmarted a system designed to exclude him. Yet beneath the surface, the same forces that had disrupted his childhood continued to tighten their grip. His eventual arrest and imprisonment were not just the end of a reckless chapter, but the collapse of an illusion that freedom could be found without purpose or direction. Prison, a place intended to break spirits, became the setting for Malcolm's most profound transformation. Removed from the noise and desperation of the outside world, he was forced into stillness, and within that silence, something unexpected emerged. He began to read, at first clumsily, then obsessively. Books opened doors that had long been sealed, allowing him to explore history, language, philosophy, and the hidden structures of power that shaped society. Each page sharpened his mind and expanded his understanding, giving form to the questions he had carried since childhood. Education, however, was only part of the awakening. Through letters and conversations, Malcolm was introduced to the teachings of the Nation of Islam, a movement that spoke directly to the pain, pride, and identity he had struggled to reconcile. Its message offered an explanation for his suffering and a framework for self-respect that the outside world had consistently denied him. For the first time, he encountered an ideology that did not demand his silence or submission, but instead insisted on discipline, self-knowledge, and responsibility. Saman. This period was not a sudden conversion, but a slow and difficult internal battle. Malcolm confronted his past mistakes, questioned his beliefs, and wrestled with the weight of change. Yet with each step, he felt his sense of self strengthening. Prison no longer felt like a dead end. It became a forge, reshaping his anger into clarity and his frustration into focus. The man who entered confinement searching for survival would leave with a mission. By the time Malcolm emerged back into the world, he was no longer simply reacting to injustice. He had developed a disciplined intellect, a sharpened voice, and a worldview rooted in both personal experience and deep study. The boy who had been pushed aside, the young man who had chased escape, had evolved into someone prepared to challenge the very foundations of the society that once dismissed him. This transformation did not erase his past. It gave it meaning, setting the stage for the forceful and uncompromising leader he was about to become. When Malcolm stepped back into society, he did not return as the man who had been taken away years earlier. The time spent in isolation had given him something rare: clarity. He carried himself with discipline, spoke with precision, and viewed the world through a lens sharpened by study and lived experience. It was during this period that he took the name Malcolm X, a declaration that the past imposed on him would no longer define his future. The name was not a symbol of anger, but of reclamation and assertion that identity could be chosen, not assigned. Within the Nation of Islam, Malcolm's presence was impossible to ignore. His words did not drift. They struck. He spoke with an intensity that commanded attention. Yet his message resonated because it reflected realities many already knew but rarely heard acknowledged aloud. He addressed the quiet frustrations of northern cities, where inequality wore different masks but inflicted the same wounds. To those who felt invisible, Malcolm offered recognition. To those who felt powerless, he spoke of discipline, responsibility, and collective strength. Crowds grew wherever he appeared. His speeches traveled far beyond the walls of temples, carried by word of mouth, radio, and print. He did not rely on spectacle or empty reassurance. He challenged listeners to examine their condition honestly and to see themselves as active participants in shaping their future. This unapologetic approach distinguished him from other voices of the era and made him impossible for institutions to dismiss or ignore. As his influence expanded, so did the attention of authorities who viewed his growing following with suspicion. Malcolm's leadership was not confined to words alone. When members of the black community faced unjust treatment, particularly at the hands of law enforcement, he insisted on accountability and visibility. He understood the power of presence, of order, and of collective discipline. In moments of crisis, he demonstrated an ability to mobilize people without chaos, projecting control where disorder was expected. This unsettled those accustomed to seeing anger but not organization, protest but not restraint. Such moments revealed why he was both admired and feared. To supporters, Malcolm represented dignity and self-respect in a society that systematically denied both. To critics, he was a disruptor of comfort, someone who refused to soften his message for approval. Media attention followed, often framing him through narrow stereotypes, yet even distorted portrayals could not erase the substance of his arguments. Each appearance amplified his reach, turning him into one of the most recognized and debated figures in the country. Behind the scenes, surveillance intensified. Government agencies monitored his speeches, movements, and associations, interpreting his rise as a potential threat to stability rather than a reflection of unresolved injustice. Yet this scrutiny did little to slow him. Malcolm remained focused, convinced that silence posed a greater danger than attention. He believed that naming problems openly was a necessary step toward confronting them, even when the cost was personal risk. Despite the pressure, he continued to evolve. His experiences reinforced his belief in self-determination. not as isolation, but as the foundation for respect. He urged people to understand their history, discipline their lives, and reject narratives that portrayed them as dependent or inferior. His leadership style was direct, demanding, and deeply personal, shaped by the hardships he had endured and the transformation he had achieved. By this stage, Malcolm X had become more than a speaker within an organization. He was a symbol of intellectual awakening and unapologetic self-definition, embodying a challenge that reached beyond any single movement. His voice carried the weight of experience, and his presence signaled a shift in the conversation, one that could no longer be controlled or easily contained. As Malcolm X's influence grew, so did the strain beneath the surface of the movement that had elevated him. What once felt like a clear mission began to reveal its boundaries. The Nation of Islam had given Malcolm structure, purpose, and a platform, but over time he became increasingly aware of its limitations. The world beyond its walls was changing rapidly, and Malcolm's mind, shaped by constant inquiry, refused to remain still. He saw political opportunities forming, alliances emerging, and global struggles unfolding that demanded engagement beyond rigid doctrine. Malcolm's vision had begun to outgrow the organization's framework. While he remained committed to dignity and self-respect, he questioned whether isolation alone could bring meaningful change. He wanted to engage openly with civil rights leaders, political institutions, and international movements, believing that progress required confronting power on every level. Yet these ideas clashed with an internal culture that discouraged collaboration and centralized authority. What had once felt like unity now felt restrictive, and the gap between Malcolm's evolving outlook and the organization's fixed ideology widened with each passing month. At the same time, troubling revelations surfaced within the leadership. Malcolm, who had built his public life on discipline, moral clarity, and accountability, found himself grappling with information that deeply conflicted with the values he preached. The internal contradictions were impossible for him to ignore. He wrestled privately with disappointment, loyalty, and truth, fully aware that speaking honestly would come at a high personal cost. Yet silence, to him, was a form of surrender. The same integrity that had guided his transformation now demanded consistency, even when it threatened everything he had built. The tension reached a breaking point in 1964. Malcolm realized that remaining within the Nation of Islam would require him to compromise either his conscience or his future. Neither option was acceptable. His decision to leave was not impulsive. It was the result of long reflection and inner conflict. Walking away meant losing protection, influence, and the organizational structure that had amplified his voice. It also meant stepping into uncertainty, exposed to criticism from former allies and scrutiny from powerful institutions already watching his every move. Yet this departure marked one of the most important turning points in Malcolm's life. Free from institutional constraints, he began to reimagine his role in the struggle for justice. He no longer spoke only to a specific following, but to a broader audience that included activists, students, political thinkers, and international leaders. His focus expanded from internal reform to systemic change, from doctrine to strategy. He sought dialogue, not submission, and cooperation, not control. Malcolm understood that the fight for equality was not confined to one organization or nation. He began framing the struggle as a human rights issue rather than a purely domestic concern, connecting the experiences of African Americans to those of oppressed people around the world. This shift reflected not a retreat from his earlier beliefs, but their refinement. He was still uncompromising in his demand for dignity, yet increasingly open to complexity, nuance, and shared responsibility. Leaving the Nation of Islam did not weaken Malcolm X. It clarified him. Stripped of titles and formal backing, He stood solely on the strength of his ideas and character. The risks were immense, but so was the potential. For the first time, he was free to speak without restriction, to question without restraint, and to build bridges that had once been forbidden. This moment revealed the depth of Malcolm's courage. He chose growth over comfort, truth over security, and principle over position. In doing so, he stepped into the most vulnerable yet powerful phase of his life, setting the stage for a vision that would continue to evolve, even as the dangers around him intensified. Freed from the constraints that had once shaped his public life, Malcolm X stepped onto a global stage at a moment when his thinking was already in motion. The break he had made was not only organizational, but internal. He carried with him questions that demanded answers beyond familiar borders, and it was this hunger for understanding that led him across oceans, cultures, and belief systems. His journey to Mecca marked the beginning of a transformation that would reshape not only his faith, but the very language he used to describe injustice. The pilgrimage confronted Malcolm with a reality he had never fully witnessed before. In the sacred spaces of Mecca, he observed people of different skin tones, nationalities, and backgrounds standing side by side, bound not by race, but by shared belief and discipline. This experience challenged assumptions formed through years of struggle within a deeply divided society. For the first time, he saw a functioning example of unity that did not rely on domination or exclusion. It was not an abstract ideal, but a lived reality unfolding around him. This encounter did not erase his understanding of racism. Instead, it expanded it. Malcolm began to recognize that racial hierarchy was not a natural condition, but a constructed system maintained by power, fear, and exploitation. His conversion to Sunni Islam reflected this broader perspective, emphasizing equality, Gursamavde, moral responsibility, Kubalata, and universal human dignity. Faith, for him, was no longer confined to protest or resistance alone. It became a framework for global justice and accountability. As his travels continued through Africa and the Middle East, Malcolm listened closely to revolutionaries, intellectuals, and leaders navigating the aftermath of colonial rule. He saw nations wrestling with the same forces that had shaped his own life: foreign control, economic dependency, and distorted narratives imposed from outside. These encounters reinforced his belief that oppression was interconnected, crossing borders and cultures while wearing different faces. The struggle of African Americans, he realized, was part of a larger human story. This realization refined his language and sharpened his critique. Malcolm no longer spoke solely in terms of racial separation, but of self-determination grounded in cooperation and shared humanity. He condemned imperialism not as a distant political concept, but as a living system that extracted wealth, erased identity, and justified inequality on a global scale. His words reflected a deeper understanding that freedom could not be achieved in isolation, nor justice secured through narrow definitions of belonging. Despite this evolution, Malcolm did not abandon the urgency that had defined his earlier voice. He remained firm in his belief that dignity must be defended and that communities had the right to protect themselves from injustice. What changed was the scope of his vision. He began to speak of alliances across cultures, of solidarity rooted in mutual respect rather than shared skin color. Racism, in his view, was no longer simply a conflict between groups, but a moral failure with consequences for all humanity. This phase of Malcolm's life revealed a thinker unafraid to grow publicly. Even when growth invited misunderstanding, he challenged both supporters and critics to reconsider fixed narratives, insisting that truth required constant examination. His willingness to revise his views was not weakness, but discipline, the same discipline that had guided his transformation years earlier. By the time he returned home, Malcolm X had become something rare, a leader shaped by struggle who refused to be confined by it. His voice now carried a global resonance, informed by faith, experience, and an unshaken commitment to justice. He stood at the intersection of personal conviction and universal responsibility, offering a vision that reached beyond borders and identities, and redefining what the fight for equality could mean in a connected world. Malcolm X's life was brought to a sudden and violent end in 1965, but his ideas did not fall silent with him. Instead, they continued to move, grow, and echo across generations. His assassination marked more than the loss of a man. It marked the loss of a voice that refused simplification, a mind that never stopped evolving, and a presence that forced the world to confront uncomfortable truths. Yet history has shown that ideas rooted in honesty and courage are far harder to eliminate than any individual. In the years that followed his death, Malcolm X's influence spread far beyond the boundaries of any single organization or era. His insistence on self-respect and cultural pride helped reshape how Black identity was understood, encouraging people to reject imposed narratives of inferiority and reclaim their history with confidence. Movements that emerged in the late 1960s drew directly from his emphasis on self-determination, discipline, and the right to defend one's dignity. Even those who disagreed with his methods could not deny the clarity with which he exposed injustice. What made Malcolm X truly unique was not just his message, but his journey. Few public figures are remembered for their willingness to change openly, to refine their beliefs in response to new understanding. He demonstrated that strength lies not in rigid certainty, but in the courage to grow. His life showed that transformation is not a betrayal of the past, but a response to truth. This capacity for evolution is one reason his legacy remains relevant in a world still grappling with inequality and division. Malcolm also expanded the conversation beyond national borders. By framing injustice as a global human issue, he connected struggles that had long been treated as separate. His words encouraged people to see how systems of power operate across cultures, and how solidarity can emerge from shared principles rather than shared appearance. This perspective continues to resonate in movements for justice around the world, reminding us that freedom is rarely isolated and that dignity is universal. There will never be another Malcolm X because the conditions that shaped him cannot be replicated. He was the product of a specific historical moment, forged by hardship, sharpened by study, and driven by an uncompromising demand for truth. Yet his legacy does not belong to the past. It lives on in every challenge to silence, every refusal to accept inequality as normal, and every effort to align action with conscience. As we reflect on his life, we are reminded that change often begins with discomfort, and progress with questions that refuse easy answers. Malcolm X leaves behind not a script to follow, but a standard to measure ourselves against: honesty, courage, and the relentless pursuit of justice. Thank you for taking the time to watch and reflect on this story. If you found value in this journey through history and ideas, please like the video, subscribe to the channel, and stay with us as we continue to explore stories that shape how we understand the world.